Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Taylor Allen, and today we're going to be going through the top 10 development considerations in San Antonio. As I mentioned, my name is Taylor Allen. I'm here in our San Antonio office and serve as a market leader. I've been doing site and land development work in the San Antonio and Central Texas area for the last 10 years and have focused on a variety of uses, but all in the site and land development realm in this area. I've been with WGI for the past 10 years, again, based here in San Antonio, but we do have locations spread out across the country, covering Texas, Florida, and a number of states up along the eastern seaboard. Two of our newest offices on this map include our Denver office in Colorado and the Arlington, DC area. And here's just a quick overview of what we're going to be going through today. Again, the top 10 issues and processes to consider when going through a development process in San Antonio and the surrounding areas. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So number one, land use and zoning. This is something that is going to define a lot of the abilities or restrictions that you'll be able to develop within a site. For sites that are within ETJs or purely within counties, typically land use and zoning regulations do not apply. But for those sites within city limits, zoning requirements will define a number of design criteria relating to minimum lot sizes, whether it be overall area, width, or depth, setbacks that buildings need to be from property lines. Building heights are regulated within zoning. Some jurisdictions have impervious cover restrictions within their zoning requirements. In areas like certain parts of San Antonio, TCEQ applies those requirements. Density for residential uses are defined within zoning. And so all of those things need to be considered at the early stages of the site layout to make sure that building and parking requirements are all falling within those guidelines. In San Antonio in particular, we do have a couple of unique opportunities that allow for greater flexibility in achieving certain projects. We've got IDZ, which is infill development zone, and MXD, which is for mixed use developments. Each one of those provide a lot more flexibility in what is allowed both by use, but also providing some flexibility on some of those other more standardized components that other zoning districts would have, including height, setbacks, parking requirements. And so both of those can be useful tools if there's something that is maybe outside of the typical zoning designations that the code might apply. So great opportunities, particularly in the urban infill area where more suburban type zoning doesn't allow us to achieve what we're trying to get done in more dense and urban areas. One thing that we always try and remind people if you're going through a zoning change or contemplating a zoning change is that there needs to be a lot of communication both with city staff as well as elected and appointed officials, individuals on zoning commissions, city council. Those are the individuals ultimately making those decisions to allow a zoning change. And a lot of times that is going to involve interaction with immediate neighbors, neighborhood associations, stakeholders within a community that zoning might be impacting. And so that's something that we always encourage folks to be as transparent as we can and have those conversations as early as possible to make sure that the request is going to be heard and as successful as possible. Depending on the scale of the zoning request or change, we always like to include a land use attorney to make sure that the process is running as efficient as possible. So we're always happy to help make those connections as well for sites that can benefit from that. All right, number 2, environmental requirements. Just a quick note here, this project on the left-hand side of the screen is a project that we recently completed, 129th Street. It's along the San Antonio River on the Museum Reach. And as part of that, what we'll touch base here in this section is coordinating with San Antonio River Authority for some of their low impact development requirements for properties up against the river frontage. So environmental considerations can cover a lot of topics, all very site-specific conditions, from natural conditions that can cover endangered species that require some specialists to examine wetlands, tree preservation and mitigation, which I'll come back to in a second, sensitive watersheds that may have above and beyond water quality requirements. And some parts of San Antonio, particularly along the northern side within the Edwards recharge zone, there's a potential for cave or karst features. And then in the built condition, there may be contamination from previous uses if there were things like dry cleaners or gas stations previously used, and then historical significant components, which we'll touch base on another section here in a moment. But going back to the protected trees is something I wanted to spend a little bit of time on. In San Antonio, there's a very robust tree preservation and mitigation process, which is something that we always try and remind folks of early on in the process. If there's a site that has a lot of tree cover or a lot of larger diameter trees on the site, there is a administrative exception variance request process, AEVR, which provides an opportunity to alleviate some of the mitigation or preservation requirements if there are certain specific site constraints on the site. This process has recently changed in how it's reviewed. And so what had been previously a much more direct administrative process with city staff now has a more of a committee review process that city staff helps to facilitate, and ultimately still trying to work with sites in conditions where maybe meeting the code in its entirety isn't a feasible option. However, that process is taking longer than previous AEVR rounds that we've seen in the past. So just something to keep in mind from a timeline perspective. And again, something that we're trying to start those conversations on as early on in the site layout process to know if what we're proposing is going to be viable from a tree preservation and mitigation perspective. All right, Section 3, stormwater drainage and floodplain maps. So in San Antonio and really in a lot of the jurisdictions in Texas, stormwater and floodplain delineation is a very critical part of not only site selection, but also feasibility and site design. The City of San Antonio, along with all of the adjacent municipalities that you might be working in outside of San Antonio, are going to have a design criteria manual that define what needs to be studied and analyzed as far as stormwater, whether it be detention or allowable increases downstream if there's public infrastructure or existing creeks or waterways that can accept an increase in impervious cover. Some of the moving pieces here that we are trying to keep our clients and prospective projects aware of. Over the last year or so, Atlas 14 rainfall intensities have been modified. And so even if you're looking at sites that may have had previous drainage studies completed, there will likely be a need to revisit those to just ensure that the current rainfall intensities don't change what those previous assumptions and conclusions were. So something that may require a little bit of additional rework even for sites that had been previously reviewed under previous rainfall intensities. The other thing is in San Antonio, the San Antonio River Authority and City of San Antonio are going through a modification of floodplain maps. There are draft maps available, and that being the best available data that we've got, that is what the city is looking at to identify the extent of floodplain as it relates to defining drainage easements on plats and cross-sections to use when studying adjacent floodplains. So going to FEMA's firm maps is always a great first step, but we always are checking that against the current draft maps to see where there might be deviations or modifications that we would expect to be being accepted by FEMA in the near future. So just something that we're always trying to keep on top of to make sure that we've got the best available information as projects are moving forward. All right, number 4, utility entitlements. So here in San Antonio, I think we've got it relatively easy compared to some other jurisdictions that might have multiple entities to deal with. We are working almost exclusively with San Antonio Water System for any water and sewer connections or capacity considerations. Again, this is something that we encourage getting in front of as early as possible within a project, particularly larger scale ones where a utility service agreement might be necessary to determine if there are offsite improvements required to deliver the needed capacity. I think in addition to that process with SAWS, we are seeing a lot of adjacent municipalities having increased issues with capacity. So definitely questions that we're wanting to ask very early in the process to make sure that the proposed use or development that you're looking at will have adequate service from whatever utility provider is available. And not only will there be capacity, but are there offsite improvements that are going to be necessary to achieve that capacity? So making sure that there's a clear understanding on what that process looks like, what the expectations are, what the timing is to make those improvements as early on in the process. Number 5, electric service. And again, just a quick plug here. This photo is of a site that we've got under construction just east of Broadway near the Pearl here in San Antonio, if you're familiar. This is going to be a 395-unit multifamily project. This utilized the IDZ zoning that I mentioned before to allow the density that they were looking for. And this one in particular required a lot of coordination with CPS, which is what we're about to get into, both for service as well as easement negotiation to achieve the density and street frontage that this project and area was looking to achieve. All right, so again, here in San Antonio, we are dealing with CPS Energy for any power and gas needs for a site. This is very much a critical path item for any new development, given the timelines associated with both design as well as supplies to serve sites. CPS Energy in particular has been struggling with supply chain issues just at a national and global level coming out of COVID for things like transformers, conduit, meter boxes, and that is a moving target that they're monitoring, and we're keeping close with updates on them to stay abreast of what pinch points they're having on delivering certain types of material. They're doing a great job of tracking that and sharing those updates with the development community, but just something that we're staying on top of, so that way our teams and designs can stay aware of items that may need to be accelerated in order to meet deadlines to energize and activate new projects. A few items here, CPS is going through a rate increase review, both for their design and construction fees, as well as for customer service fees. Those are likely to be rolled out throughout the end of this year and beginning of next year, and will affect pricing as it relates to getting designs from CPS for new power. Again, just trying to keep up with elevating costs across the industry. One thing that, in addition to the design and service piece, CPS is involved in the plotting process when it comes to easements, particularly on urban infill sites where sites are looking to be much denser, typically have smaller footprints to begin with, easements can make a big impact. And so we work closely with CPS designers and project architects and developers to get as efficient as we can with meeting what CPS needs from long-term access to be able to increase service in an area, but also make sure that projects are able to be successful on as much of the site as they can build within. All right, number 6, traffic impacts and roadway. So in San Antonio, we've got traffic impact studies that are triggered for any projects that are generating 76 peak hour trips or more based on their proposed development. The way that's calculated will vary based on the use. So with multifamily or residential, it's a trip per unit. Other retail or commercial, it's based on square footage and what the use is. But whenever we get over that 76 peak hour trip is when we're going to have a traffic impact analysis required. WGI does have a mobility and traffic division that can help prepare both getting traffic counts for the adjacent roadways and then putting together the analysis that's required to go through an impact analysis with the city. Depending on where you're at in the site, that may just be direct with City of San Antonio staff. If you're in the ETJ or fronting a Bexar County road, that'll be reviewed and commented on by both the city and the county. And in some instances, if we're in the ETJ and also have tech stop frontage, you could be dealing with all three. And so there just is a lot of coordination required to make sure that each of those three groups are getting what they need from an information standpoint, and working closely with design staff as well as the project team to make sure that some sites have very specific access needs, whether it be for future residents or deliveries or any number of things. And so negotiating driveway widths and locations is very critical in these TIA reviews. These can happen both during the plat or the building permit, depending on what information and detail of a potential development is known. But through either of those processes, the TIA will get handled. There are no impact fees, roadway impact fees in the city of San Antonio. Those do exist in surrounding municipalities. So places like New Braunfels do have a roadway impact fee. Those are based on where you're located within the city. They have different rates based on the location within their jurisdiction. In San Antonio, again, we don't have a roadway impact fee, but a TA may indicate that there are mitigation improvements required to offset the proposed impact of your project. So sometimes that can be a turn lane into your project. Sometimes that can be a traffic signal. Sometimes that can be restriping of a road to accommodate traffic movements. And all of that's going to be site-specific, adjacent roadway specific, and something that is negotiated and determined through that TIA review. All right, number 7, our neighborhood and political influence. So touched on this in a few other sections, but there are a number of processes in any jurisdiction that you may be looking to develop in that is going to require input and approval from an elected body, whether that be a zoning commission, a planning commission, city council, in San Antonio, something like an HDRC, Historic Design Review Commission. And each one of those requires a certain understanding of the process, when to engage and how to engage both the elected or appointed individuals as well as the stakeholders and community members that have the ability to have their input in that public process. As I mentioned when we were talking about land use and zoning, in San Antonio in particular, many of the city council districts lean very heavily on neighborhood input, particularly with zoning changes. And so that's where it's very important to have an open line of communication with adjacent neighbors or neighborhood associations that might be impacted by or have an opinion on a project. Again, all of those are conversations and negotiations, and not everyone is able to get everything that they want through those processes. But I think we see the greatest success when individuals at least have the conversation and understand what the concerns are. Not every project can make every group get 100% of what they want, but I think it's important to show that you're open to understanding what that impact might look like. Again, this is a great opportunity where a land use attorney can be a resource. In addition to, where we like to get involved in these is if we need to show what type of impact traffic might have or drainage might have on a project. Those are very typical questions and concerns from surrounding neighbors on any kind of change to property. So we're always happy to provide that information for everyone to be aware of what those impacts might be. All right, number 8, parking. Going back to land use and zoning, that is where parking requirements are going to be defined based on where your site's located and the type of development that you're wanting to do. Most jurisdictions, San Antonio included, have minimum and maximum parking requirements based on the type of use that you are proposing. Some of those can change depending on geographic location. So downtown areas, university campuses, special use districts may have a more regional parking solution that isn't a site-specific requirement, but by and large, most of the time, that parking requirement is needing to be achieved within the site. There are some opportunities to be flexible with that. Some of those zoning districts that I mentioned earlier, IDZ and MXD, provide some flexibility on parking requirements. There are opportunities for shared or off-use parking agreements if there's a mix of uses that maybe have differing peak demands, where something that is operating Monday to Friday versus something in a neighboring property that's primarily on the weekends or in the evenings that can share parking, so that way each property isn't having to fully park but not be utilized at the same time. There's also compact parking as an option for sites where it makes sense. But again, something to be considered as you're going through an initial site layout to make sure. And then again, each jurisdiction has parking ratios that vary, as well as parking stall sizes. So just things to be aware of on that initial site layout to make sure that you've got the current and correct dimensions for those initial site layouts. All right, next section, historic preservation. And just to note, this project here that you're seeing a picture of is the St. John's Adaptive Reuse. It's just south of downtown at the Mission Concepcion site. This was a former Catholic Church facility, and the existing buildings on site had been redeveloped with the addition of some new construction to create a really great mixed income 300 unit multifamily project. This one had a lot of the components that we've discussed so far, in addition to this historic preservation component that we'll jump into right here. So San Antonio has a very rich and long history, and as such, there are some processes and steps in place to ensure that that is being documented and preserved when possible. Part of that is dealing with existing structures. So like the project photo that we were just looking at, there were existing structures on site that needed to be maintained and improved from an architectural standpoint. That goes through the Historic Design Review Commission. There are other sites like the one we're looking at here. This is the Art House Lofts. This was just recently completed earlier this year. It's a 300-unit apartment complex in Southtown. This site didn't have any contributing structures on site, so it was all new construction. However, given its proximity to the San Antonio River, and the presence of an acequia, we went through a review with Office of Historic Preservation. Any site that is within a certain proximity of the San Antonio River or any of the creeks downtown or adjacent to any known historically significant sites triggers a review by Office of Historic Preservation during the platting process and again during the building permit process. This often includes a preliminary site investigation or excavation to determine early on if there's any significant features on a piece of property. The most common features that we're on the lookout for in these types of sites are acequias and sometimes building foundations or walls. Depending on the type of project and what jurisdictions we're dealing with, there's a number of creative mitigation opportunities. Working closely with the architect, oftentimes with structural engineering on foundation designs, and the Office of Historic Preservation to document and then mitigate as best as possible any features that are found on site. An asterisk to that is if there's anything that elevates a project to federal funding. So the most common example of that is if a project using HUD financing for a multifamily project, that is now has a federal component, and therefore now we're dealing with both the Office of Historic Preservation at a local level, but also the Texas Historical Commission at a state level. And oftentimes, the way we're able to mitigate items found on site gets a little bit more restrictive because usually in those instances we can't disturb any of those features in any way. And so just something to be mindful of, some of those features are mapped, but are really usually discovered and confirmed during a field investigation. So we try and make that, call that out early as a potential risk, and just something to be aware of, to have that information as early as possible before getting too far through and committing to a site plan that could be impacted by that. In addition to that initial study, during the platting and permitting phase, oftentimes there's going to be a requirement for construction monitoring. So there may be a requirement for an archaeologist to be on site periodically throughout construction in the event that something is identified that wasn't picked up during an initial review. So just something to be mindful of in certain parts of San Antonio. All right. Our last item here are impact fees. And just about any jurisdiction you're in, this can be one of the most significant fees you will have from a permitting standpoint. And in most cases, at a minimum, you're going to have a water impact fee, a sewer impact fee, and those are essentially connection fees to be able to tap into existing infrastructure and begin to take service. In San Antonio, again, those are paid to San Antonio Water System, and as a ballpark figure for those of you that may not be familiar of what that could look like, a typical 300-unit apartment complex, that fee combined between water and sewer can oftentimes exceed $1 million. And so just something to be aware of early, that is a payment that will be due prior to being able to take service. Those rates, again, are assessed based on geographically where you're located. There's several different zones with varying fee rates depending on where you're at in the city of San Antonio for both water and sewer. And we can generate those estimates early based on the site location and proposed use, so that way you at least have a placeholder number as you're working through budgeting and initial due diligence. Things to be aware of, at least on the utility impact fees, those are usually reassessed every 5 years. And so for the San Antonio Water System, that would put a potential rate increase coming in 2024. Impact fee rates are typically locked in at whatever the current rate is as soon as a plat is recorded. Each jurisdiction makes decisions a little differently on how they lock in existing rates when they're approaching a rate change. But the most common process is having a recorded plat in order to lock in whatever the current rates are. The City of New Braunfels recently increased their impact fees, and again, plats recorded prior to that rate change are able to maintain the previous rates. Any new projects are going to be assessed under the new rate structure. And then the City of Seguin is initiating a potential rate increase process as well that will likely take effect either at the end of this year or beginning of the next. So just things to keep in mind if projects or due diligence are going to be straddling some of those rate changes, to make sure that you've got the most current or potential rate within budgets for planning. Additional fees that come into play are tree removal and mitigation. So that's for any amount of trees removed that are protected, significant, or heritage. There's a varying fee associated with that, in addition to the potential of replanting. And then the City of San Antonio has a fee in lieu of detention. So if there is a drainage study shows that there isn't going to be an adverse impact to your neighbors or downstream based on your proposed increase in impervious cover, you don't have to design and build a detention pond, but there is a fee in lieu of detaining. And so oftentimes that can generate a savings just from additional land that's able to be utilized for buildings or amenities within a project. So there are zones within the City of San Antonio that are automatically in a mandatory detention, so that fee in lieu of is not even an option. But there's a large chunk of the city that is really up to a design and analysis to determine if detention is going to be necessary or the fee is an option. And then again, like we touched base on in an earlier section, other municipalities adjacent to San Antonio that you may be looking to do work in have additional fees. Parkland dedication fees range from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. There's roadway impact fees that other municipalities have. So again, just keep in mind those fees, both the rates and the types of fees can vary even in the immediate surrounding areas. All right, and then a quick little bonus is some of the items that we try and keep at the top of all of our team's minds for some of our rules of land development. Checking our emails and returning voicemails, we know that time is critical in a lot of the phases of development, so we want to make sure that we are keeping everyone updated as best we can. What must go up, what goes up must come down. We must add value. Relationships are important, and most importantly, there's no crying in land development. And then one other item to add to this full bonus section, just something that we're starting to field some more questions about, is coming out of the state's recent some of the new House bills that were recently adopted. There is a new House bill that allows landowners to effectively opt out of being within cities' ETJs. And I know that in some instances that may seem like a really great opportunity to make that request and remove completely from an ETJ. We have not seen that process go all the way through on any site at this point. And something that we'd be happy to discuss with someone if that's what you're looking for. That may not always be the best solution for a number of reasons, again, site-specific, and something that may involve not only us looking at with you, but also a land use attorney to help understand some of the implications or opportunities that could be associated with that. So something that may be on some of y'all's radar, but something we're keeping tabs on and continuing to monitor as well. And then just as a reminder, hopefully this was helpful for those of y'all that have been through this. This is the first time you're seeing this. For those of you that joined us last year when we did this, hopefully these were good reminders and refreshes and updates on some of these topics. I am always happy to be a resource for folks as y'all are looking at new and potential projects. I tell folks all the time, I'd much rather give you the bad news or big issue on a site while you're still early in due diligence and not the day after you closed on a piece of property. So don't hesitate to reach out to myself or anyone in any of our offices for any questions or clarifications that we might be able to help, so that way you have as much information as possible before making decisions on moving forward. So with that, I will open it up to any questions. I think we might be a couple in the Q&A section. All right. So this first one is, what timeframes are you currently seeing from the submission to permit in the city of San Antonio? So for a building permit, I think a good average to expect is at least 90 days. That can go up and down with a number of factors. One would be if the site has already been platted. If the site is needing to be platted, we have the opportunity to do that concurrently with a building permit, which is a great tool that we have in San Antonio. Not all jurisdictions allow plats and permits to go concurrently together, but that's a really great time saver when developing in the city of San Antonio. Drainage, I would say, is one of the most critical path items in review, and something that if we are having to plat the property, we try and pull that drainage study as early in the process as possible. If we know what a project site is ultimately looking to be developed into, we like to have that drainage analysis at the plat take into account that ultimate condition. So that way, when we get into the building permit phase, that analysis and review has already been gone through with city staff, and we're able to point back to that previous approval and help compress that review timeline when we're going in for a building permit. So there's a lot of ways that we can work to try and expedite things over the overall process, and something that we can discuss on a site-by-site basis on the best strategy for what to submit and when, to make sure that things are sequenced as best as possible. Next question is, any tips or tricks to help expedite CPS review process? Really, it's starting it as early as possible and having as best information as possible. So typically that's going to involve some information from an MEP engineer who's going to be working on the site. Having accurate load calcs for what a project demand is going to be is really important for CPS to generate a feasible design. And there's a number of processes within CPS that allow us to kind of kickstart their design review. But really, the best thing we can do on that is just get the process started as early as possible. And both for the design side, but also once we have that design, the invoice from CPS is generated, and once that invoice is paid, that gets your project in the queue for transformers or any CPS provided material. And so again, just pulling all of that early on in the process helps sort of pull your project further up in the queue, as opposed to waiting until a building permit is approved. We want to pull that up as quickly as possible. All right, and then in San Antonio, is there any such thing as compatibility standards or requirements for commercial developments to be set back from single-family properties? So the main thing there is going to be commercial or setbacks defined by zoning. So the main thing is going to be just the dimension of a setback, and that's going to be defined based on whatever commercial or industrial use you might be proposing, and whether or not you're abutting single family or residential use. And so other than the setback, then that's really the primary thing to contemplate. We have seen in instances where maybe we're looking to rezone to something like a commercial or industrial adjacent to residential or single family use. And that's where that conversation and negotiation that I was mentioning earlier can come into play, where if you're willing to maybe go above and beyond what a city standard requires, whether it be for setback or a landscaping buffer or a higher quality fencing material or screening material to help ensure that any potential existing neighbors can have an adequate buffer, maybe above and beyond what the city requires. Those are some of the opportunities to negotiate and make sure that it's as much of a win-win process for changes like that. All right. I'll give it another few seconds if there's any other questions that might pop in. And if you don't have it right now, but think of it after this, again, don't hesitate to reach out to myself or anyone in our offices. Happy to help either by email or phone or meeting in person. Always happy to do that as well to help discuss any potential sites that you might be looking at so that we can help partner with you on strategy and opportunities to make sure that anything that you're planning can be as successful as possible. All right, well, I don't see any new questions popping in, so thanks again for taking some time today to learn a little bit about the top 10 development considerations here in San Antonio. I look forward to connecting with y'all here in the near future. And again, don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything we can do for you.